because the director of our Middle East program, Hala Esfandiari, is in prison, in Evin prison in Tehran. I regret very much she cannot be here, and most of our days these days are concerned with efforts to try and obtain her early release so that she can rejoin her family in Washington and come back to her work. But I appreciate all of you very much coming here today. We're very happy to co-host this meeting with Friends of UNRWA, and Karen Moroz is here as the executive director of Friends of UNRWA. Karen AbuZayd has spent the last 2 years as Secretary General, I guess it is, of UNRWA. She had before that 19 years, I believe, working for the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, and I believe had teaching stints even before that in Kampala, Uganda, and in Juba in Sudan. And her first link to this institution is what she shares with the president and director of the Woodrow Wilson Center, Lee Hamilton. They both were undergraduates at DePaul College in Greencastle, Indiana, which is a great start. So Karen, welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center. We're very happy to have you. You'll talk for a bit, and then she's graciously agreed to answer some questions. But welcome to the center. Thank you.
I can say some things in advance. I just have come from Greencastle, Indiana, having given my the commencement address, following in the footsteps of Lee Hamilton, and receiving the McNaughton Public Service Award, also following in his footsteps.
Very well
so I'm
done.
very pleased about that. Yes. Again, a couple of other prefaces. Before beginning my remarks on the topics at hand, I'd like to express my concern for Hala Esfandiari, director of the Middle East program here, who, as we speak, is detained in prison and I understand about to be sentenced, which was even worse. I think we know that the detention and arrest of staff on spurious grounds is a practice with which I'm quite familiar, and I think it's important that we express our solidarity with him, as I do for Ms. Esfandiari today.
Thank you.
I thank you all for inviting me here to share a few thoughts on one of the most vexing and intractable issues of our time. I'd actually ask that the title be a test for our time. I've been talking a lot about challenges, and one of the things I'm not doing today is dwelling at great length, at least, on the security situation, despite what's happening in West Bank and Gaza and what's happening in Lebanon, and I'll be happy to talk about those at the end or answer questions. I'm not going to dwell on the access and movement problems that we have. I will refer to those. I'm not going to dwell on the economy, which I've been doing a lot lately, because what's happening to the economy, or the lack of an economy in the occupied territory particularly, is very serious, has very serious consequences on what we do and try to do for the refugees. I want to look at things from what I think are the majority of how Palestinians see us as the international community. Do a little bit of history, but see from the point of view of what their expectations are of us and how we are or are not meeting those. So if I start at the beginning, in the space of 11 months from 1947 to 1948, some 800,000 Palestinians were compelled to abandon their homes and livelihoods for the safety of refugee camps in Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, Gaza, and the West Bank. In the fierce conflict that followed the establishment of the State of Israel, many Palestinians experienced violent events, while others heard of tragic happenings in nearby villages. All of them fled in fear and desperation, compelled by the survival instinct and motivated by a desire to weather what they believed was but a temporary storm. Today, as some 4.4 million Palestine refugees prepare to mark the 60th anniversary of their flight into exile, they continue to rely, like those before them, and to a greater extent than they may have expected, on survival skills and sheer determination to endure adverse circumstances. This is not to say that there is nothing to reckon on the positive side of the balance sheet. through my agency's work, UNRWA, and with the support of host countries, donors, and other agencies, significant achievements have been wrought in health, education, social safety net support, microfinance, and infrastructure programs. The literacy rate for Palestinians in the occupied territory is 92.4%, compared to roughly 67% for the Middle East region, and communicable diseases have been eradicated. In spite of these and other advances, Palestine refugees and Palestinians generally contend with threats to their lives and livelihoods and suffer levels of material deprivation that belie these positive development indicators. Half the children in the occupied Palestinian territory have witnessed their school besieged by troops. A quarter have seen their schools exposed to shelling or firing, and nearly a fifth have seen a schoolmate killed by troops. Most are exposed to violence on a near daily basis, including, tragically, from their own communities and families. Since the post-election economic blockade, malnutrition has become an additional threat to the lives and futures of children in the Palestinian territory. 1 in 10 may now suffer long-term effects of malnutrition. Looking back over the past 59 years, it'd be difficult to avoid the inference that in the face of extraordinary Palestinian fortitude, the balance sheet is very much in the red. This raises a number of questions. Why is the account in such a sorry state? On whose shoulders rests responsibility for the political, economic, and humanitarian deficits that plague the occupied Palestinian territory? And what prospects are there for the future of Palestinians, and indeed, Palestine? These are pertinent and necessary questions, yet in posing and answering them, many of us tend to adopt a somewhat detached attitude. We dwell on the grim conditions Palestinians face and on the shortcomings of their political leaders, as though the Palestinian issue inhabits a world apart from ours. I believe we should not continue to hold ourselves aloof, and that in our quest to move forward, the questions that must be asked and answered include those that probe our own stances and attitudes. By putting ourselves forward as sponsors, mediators, and brokers, have we created and encouraged expectations and dependencies only to turn our back on addressing them? I was drawn to this topic because I see the Palestinian issue as one that puts on trial our own perceptions of ourselves. My intention is to turn the searchlight inward to see whether we live up to the image that we project to the Palestinian people. The image that has to do with the ideals we profess in a modern, enlightened world, ideals that would be familiar to the illustrious gentleman whose name this institute bears. We cannot for certain know what he would have made of the long struggle of the Palestinian people since 1948. What we can say is that we, as a global community, have come a long way since that time. Many of the precepts which Woodrow Wilson espoused with so much energy were in his time regarded as idealistic, perhaps even fanciful. The inviolability of self-determination for subjugated peoples, the value of multilateralism and cooperation in international relations, aversion to international conflict, and the conviction that high office was perfectly compatible with high ideals. It required another world war, hard on the heels of the first, and bringing in its wake unprecedented human and material cost to make these ideas accepted in international discourse. What we refer to as the international community is underpinned by a variety of complex features, many of which have evolved over time. For the purposes of this discussion, I will address 4 of these features, which account for a large part of the international community's image. These are human rights protection, the eradication of poverty, promotion of good governance, and peaceful resolution of disputes. I will juxtapose glimpses of how these have played out in the occupied Palestinian territory with a view to illustrating the divide between the picture that we have of ourselves and the consequences of our actions and our missions. Before we delve into the subject, I'd like to state by way of a small caveat that, as one would expect from the mandate of a humanitarian and human development agency such as mine, that my views are grounded in a humanitarian perspective. However, I concede that given the complex and evolving situation in the occupied territory, other angles and viewpoints are important and essential, and I'll be interested to hear some of those at the end of my presentation. The starting point is the protection of human rights as one of the defining paradigms of our time. The UN Charter affirmed the faith of nations in the dignity and worth of every human being and in equal rights for the peoples of all nations, big and small. It imposed upon the United Nations and the member states an obligation to promote higher standards of living, economic and social progress and development, and observance of human rights and fundamental freedoms for all. The Charter recognized that international cooperation is indispensable in tackling problems of an international nature, and therefore included economic, humanitarian, and human rights problems among the challenges that demand a multilateral approach. The Charter was the foundation upon which a plethora of well-known conventions and instruments flourished: the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Geneva Conventions on the Protection of Persons in Armed Conflict, the International Covenants on Civil, Political, Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the Conventions to prevent and punish the crime of genocide, to prohibit torture, and to eliminate racial discrimination and discrimination against women. These and other instruments have been fortified in no small measure by General Assembly and Security Council resolutions over the years, as well as by state practice. As a result of this process, what some would have considered not so long ago as strictly moral concepts are now imbued with the force of international law. The idea that the rights and freedoms of individuals everywhere, regardless of their national or ethnic origin, can and should be the responsibility of states and peoples elsewhere is now accepted and written into conventions. States have themselves invoked the protection of human rights as justification, at least in part, for concerted political and military action in other states. I must say that the human rights face of the international community is rather difficult to reconcile with the comprehensive violations that are omnipresent in Palestinian lives. That dissonance, the gap between what the international community professes and what it allows by action and omission to occur, is hugely baffling to the people of the occupied Palestinian territory and all Palestinians. Armed conflict, both with Israel and internally, regularly results in Palestinian deaths at rates that challenge the preeminence given to the right to life in human rights discourse. The over 10,000 Palestinians, including 116 women and 380 children, reportedly held in Israeli detention, raise questions about the extent to which respect is accorded to the prohibition against arbitrary arrest. And according to State Department country reports on human rights, there are credible doubts about compliance with the customary international law prohibition against cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment, a prohibition from which international law permits no derogations. In the occupied West Bank, a broad spectrum of Palestinian rights are regularly and gravely abused through armed conflict and the policies imposed by the occupying power. With some 549 physical obstacles to movement, a 44% increase over last year, a paralyzing regime of rigidly enforced permits, an increasingly stifling system of cantonization, and the growth of the constricting wall, freedom of movement barely exists for Palestinians in the West Bank. Nor does the dignity promised to all human beings by human rights instruments. On the contrary, Palestinians in the West Bank lead a fragmented existence, dispossessed of normal life, and constrained by the coercive power of the occupation to endure forced separation from their land, from their families, their services, and even their places of worship. If the human rights paradigm is a defining aspect of the international community, then so too is the prominence we give to the issue of reducing poverty. This is a preoccupation underpinned by the right of everyone to enjoy a standard of living adequate for health and well-being. The first item on the list of Millennium Development Goals is the eradication of extreme poverty and hunger, with the specific goal being to halve by the year 2015 the number of people living on less than $1 a day. In the Millennium Declaration, heads of states and governments solemnly pledged to spare no effort to free our fellow men, women, and children from the abject and dehumanizing conditions of extreme poverty. There's a staggering irony in the contrast between the universal commitment to poverty eradication, as expressed in these words, and the decision to impose on Palestinians one of the most severe sanctions regimes in recent history, including not paying salaries for people for their work, thereby virtually guaranteeing the widespread incidence of extreme poverty. That irony is not lost on Palestinians. Since February 2006, the de facto sanctions regime has slowly but surely strangled the economy and devastated livelihoods. It's ensured that donor support to the Palestinian Authority has been suspended, along with customs and tax payments from the Israeli authorities. It's often overlooked that this money actually belongs to the Palestinians and is collected by the Israeli authorities on their behalf. The 165,000 employees of the Palestinian Authority received only half their salaries in 2006. As a direct consequence of the sanctions regime and the partial payment of salaries, poverty, and unemployment are at their highest levels yet. 66% of Palestinians live in poverty, a 30% increase over 2005. There's been a 40% decline in the gross domestic product since 1999, with a close to 10% contraction occurring in 2006 alone. Unemployment has doubled since 1999. In Gaza, 80% of the population rely on food aid, UN food aid, while 88% of refugees live below the absolute poverty line. Striking as they are, these figures hardly convey the full picture of the Palestinian crisis. Having lived and worked in Gaza for almost 7 years, I can tell you that living conditions were already miserable at the beginning of 2006. In the present circumstances, it's heartbreaking to see increasingly visible evidence of progressive deterioration on the streets of Gaza as people exhaust their coping mechanisms and become ever more desperate. Palestinians are an extremely well-informed and well-educated people. They're aware that their miserable conditions are due to anything but natural causes. They know that the conditions are the result of deliberate political decisions by those who maintain the boycott, in spite of clear evidence of the cruelty of its impact. And directly to the point of these discussions, Palestinians cannot help but notice that the architects of the sanctions are also the guiding lights in the development of human rights and leading sponsors of the numerous global commitments on the eradication of extreme poverty and hunger. They may be forgiven for asking, then, which of these is the true face of the international community. The sanctions has also had a destructive effect on governance, law and order, and social cohesion. There have been precipitous rises in previously totally non-existent thefts, robberies, and other violent crimes in the past year, as the security agencies become increasingly overwhelmed and people resort to crime to meet their very basic needs. The security forces' lack of capacity and equipment is hardly surprising, as the security apparatus never had the chance to rebuild after having been destroyed by aerial bombardment during the Intifada. Before the onset of the current crisis, Palestinians took pride in the strength of their social networks, which were built around a robust social code and cemented by family allegiance. In days gone by, the social support system was the principal coping mechanism. On it, Palestinians relied for their answer to adversity and their resistance to social deviance. It's sad to say that under the crushing weight of poverty and desperation, the social support system is rapidly disintegrating, and with it the ability of the Palestinian Authority, starved of resources and funds, to exert anything approaching governmental authority. An especially troubling development is the rise to prominence of family-run fiefdoms in Gaza, many with their own armed security apparatus and often with criminal agendas to match. Far from exhibiting any inclination to be law-abiding, these groups challenge what is left of the authority of the Palestinian government. In short, the international boycott has done devastating damage to the Palestinian Authority, an institution whose establishment would not have been possible without substantial donor investment. Some estimates suggest that between 1993 and 2005, budgetary and developmental support to the Palestinian Authority amounted to some $6.5 billion, the highest per capita aid received by any country, developing country. All of that investment is now being allowed to crumble away as we witness the unraveling of progress achieved over the last decade in building Palestinian institutions. Growing frustration post-Oslo and various provocations led to the outbreak of the Second Intifada in September 2000, and unfortunately, this time, the resistance path chosen was that of violence. Donors were called. By 2006, the conditions had deteriorated to the point that donors were called upon to raise their levels of assistance. The additional funds are not directed at growth or economic recovery, but toward bypassing Palestinian Authority institutions, partially addressing short-term humanitarian needs, and shoring up part of the security sector at the expense of institution building, social services, and the rule of law. The level of support to the Palestinian Authority in the past was certainly related to the peace process and the high priority given to Palestinian issues by the international community. What is pertinent to my argument is that the backing given to the Palestinian Authority was also consistent with the priorities set by the United Nations, the European Union, and others to promoting good governance globally. Thus, in the sphere of governance, as in human rights and poverty eradication, we see another divide between commitments globally made and the extent to which we've been prepared to give Palestinians the benefit of those commitments. A further discrepancy can be identified in the area of the international community's approach to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The present state of the peace process is the direct result of a policy to isolate one of the parties, regardless of the fact that it happens to command a significant constituency. The policy of isolation is arguably at odds with the UN Charter's vision of a system of collective security that is founded on the peaceful settlement of disputes, mutual restraint in the use of armed force, and joint action to address threats to international peace and security. The policy to exclude part of one side is also at variance with the approach that the international community has successfully pursued in resolving other armed conflicts. In some notable and rather well-known recent examples in Western Europe and South Asia, neither the terrorist epithet nor the fact of continuing and even escalating armed conflict deterred mediators from engaging the protagonists and pressing for a solution. In these and other instances, there were several motivations behind the international community's dogged determination. One was the recognition of the high human, material, and political cost of allowing an armed conflict to continue unchecked. Another, the awareness that political conflicts are simply not susceptible to military solutions. There was also a calculated risk taken based on a balanced assessment of the conduct that the parties were capable of exercising good faith. With these factors in mind, many successful peace negotiations have proceeded on the basis of the mediator's neutrality, inclusiveness, and abstention from passing political judgment on either party's eligibility to be present at the table. In the Palestinian instance, all of the motivating factors are present. One would therefore have hoped or expected that an open, even-handed, and accommodating approach, what one might have called standard practice of peace negotiations, would have been followed. An inclusive approach would have been justified by the fact that at the time the Palestinian leadership changed at the beginning of 2006, a negotiation process was already in train with credible, competent, well-resourced negotiation structures in place. These resources could have been utilized rather than being marginalized. It is also pertinent to recall that in early 2004, the movement that's currently leading the Palestinian Authority made earnest attempts to persuade other factions to jointly declare a ceasefire on the Palestinian side. When this effort failed, owing to the reluctance of some factions to temporarily lay down their arms, the movement took the initiative in February 2005 to unilaterally commit itself to a hudna, or cessation of hostilities, and faithfully kept its word for no less than 16 months. A hudna was called off on 9 June 2006, following the deaths of 7 members of one family on the Gaza beach. The international community could have taken the hudna at face value as a strong signal of good faith, an indication that an essential player was prepared to give the negotiation process a chance. All things considered, it appears that the decision to isolate the Palestinian side and exclude it from the negotiating table was in effect a decision to freeze the peace process, regardless of the consequences. Likewise, the decision to disregard the agreement reached in Mecca in February this year continues the lack of support that was provided or not provided to the presidency since the election of President Abbas. And it's effectively a clear message of our indifference to the implications of the deadly conflict between Palestinian factions. Both decisions are examples of the discrepancy between the principles we profess and our actions on the Palestinian side. We live in an age of astonishing material wealth and technological progress. It's true that there can be no comparison between our dominance over the physical world and our ability to achieve peace and harmony with it and between nations. Yet I'd like to think that in tandem with material progress over the last half-century, we've acquired a greater and deeper understanding of the ideals and principles that must govern the conduct of states and international relationships if the evils of conflict and poverty are to be kept at bay. I have suggested some elements of that heightened international understanding. There's now almost universal acceptance of the need to promote human rights and justice for all without adverse distinction, to enhance economic opportunity for all and ensure equity and balance in the distribution of wealth. There is agreement on the futility of armed conflict as a method of resolving political conflict, and there are also prescribed limits to the permissible means and methods of war. There is universal recognition of good governance and the rule of law are bulwarks for stability and development, and it's widely acknowledged that multilateralism and inclusiveness are imperatives for effectively addressing the challenge of an interdependent world. I've pointed at gaps and disparities between the countenance we present to the world and the visage that Palestinians see. I find it striking that rather than acknowledge such gaps, we tend to create in our discourse a special place for Palestinians. We make so much of the uniqueness of their situation that it becomes implicit that their distinctiveness somehow places them outside the normal purview of international law and excuses our extraordinary record of inaction. The view from the ground, however, is that far from being unique, Palestinians are very ordinary in their desire for peace, justice, and normal life. My thesis is that these aspirations are, or should be, commonplace and available to all in a world where individual rights and freedoms, justice, equity, multilateralism, and inclusiveness are universal ideals. It happens that these are the same ideals to which Palestinians aspire, and incidentally, the measure against which they hold us, the international community, to account. Palestinian refugees are a test for our time because they demand from us no more than we have pronounced ourselves to be ready and bound to give. They expect from us no more than what we are committed to accomplish as modern states in an era of remarkable human achievement. I have argued that we've failed to be true not only to Palestinians, but also to the standards we've set ourselves. As became clear last week when we witnessed the worst ever interfactional fighting in Gaza, the consequences of this failure are grave and steadily worsening. Still, I'm convinced that there's yet time to make amends, provided we turn that searchlight inward, acknowledge the part that our actions and omissions have played in this tragic state of things, and take steps to reverse them. I believe this change of direction is necessary and possible. All it will require from us is the courage of our convictions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karen. I will open the floor. Azucena Rodriguez has a microphone, and she will give it to you to ask a question. We have a question down here in the first row.
Good morning. Thank you very much for your report. You seem to have omitted or glided past, and I wonder if you would address it, that one of the parties involved here has said it wants to destroy the state of Israel. What steps can you and UNRWA and others take to ameliorate that position, possibly to alter it, so that there becomes a live and let live as neighbors attitude at the political level? I'm sure that the Palestinian people themselves, knowing them as I do, want peace. Why can't they persuade their leaders to say, we want peace, we renounce terror, we recognize the existence of the state of Israel?
Well, my answer to that, shall I answer question by question?
Yeah,
okay.
please.
My answer to that is exactly what I've been proposing, is that we be inclusive and we incorporate these people and we talk to them and we negotiate with them rather than continue to isolate them and push them further into extremism. I have suggested that there are, if we look at the history of the behavior of the party that has this as part of its charter, that we see that, first of all, they took part in elections, which means that they have accepted the Oslo Accords, which means they accept the presence of Israel. You'll see them also nowadays using the word Israel, which they never did before. They had, the Zionist entity before. Now they talk about Israel. We have to see that there have been changes both in attitude and approach and behavior of this party that we are isolating, and that if bringing it in would help it change even further, that's what we should do.
I'd like to acknowledge the presence of the chairman of the board of the Woodrow Wilson Center, Ambassador Joe Gildenhorn, and of Ambassador Dick Murphy, an old friend of the center, and of our director and president. Nice to see you here. Yes, in the back row.
Hi, Michelle Kellerman with National Public Radio. Nice to see you again. I'm wondering if you can explain a little bit about what's going on in Lebanon, how this group managed to use this refugee camp. Are these refugee camps becoming more susceptible to political Islam, to this radicalization?
Yeah, how they managed to use it, I'm not sure, but how they managed to get into it wasn't, I suppose, that difficult. So, camp on the border. It's also a group that we've only seen, acknowledged, known was there for the past few months, in which the Palestinians in the camp and the Palestinians around Lebanon, in fact, and those in some positions of power among the Palestinians have been trying to get rid of. As far as we know, that this group is largely not Palestinian, although being in the camp they have been able, we assume, to bring a couple of people on board, and that's a result of the very difficult and dire conditions in the Palestinian refugee camps. Again, another thing that we would like to see when we're talking about the eradication of poverty and these kinds of miserable conditions that people lived in, particularly in the Lebanon refugee camps, which was beginning to happen. The Lebanese government had changed its rhetoric about what was going to what Palestinians could do, both in terms of jobs, what could be done in the improving conditions in the camp, which hadn't been done for decades, in fact, and had worked with us very closely about bringing out a serious project of about $50 million to improve living conditions throughout all the camps in Lebanon. So we are still going on with that. We are hoping very much that that will help some of this, the extremism that we see from this group that's come in, we believe, from outside to do that. We have very bad news this morning is that the ICRC negotiated a humanitarian truce so that we could get in, UNRWA could take a convoy in to take water supplies and some simple baby food and powdered milk, these sorts of things. So we did get in a 6-truck convoy. 3 of the trucks have been destroyed. Most of the supplies on them. Fortunately, nobody was injured, but they got caught in a crossfire that wasn't supposed to be taking place. So we had this very bad information just before arriving here. So.
Yes, down here in the second row.
John Salzberg with the Washington Interfaith Alliance for Middle East Peace. I couldn't agree with you more on your position on the sanctions. Do your views? Does the Secretary General share your views on the sanctions? And if so, why hasn't he spoken out, or has he?
The Secretary General has spoken out on the effects of the sanctions, and that he hopes that something can be done about them. But he's also spoken out in the way our first questioner did, in saying that there does have to be a change. It's the quartet position of which the United Nations is a member, that these conditions do have to be made, that the party, Hamas, does have to renounce terrorism, renounce violence, agree to previous commitments, and recognize the State of Israel. So the Secretary General has spoken impartially on both sides of this issue.
Yeah.
Carrie Anderson with Oxford Analytica. Could you just give us your view of the interfactional violence in Gaza, and from your perspective, what you think the main drivers are and who are the key players in this?
It's another one that we wish we knew, because the interfactional violence is between Fatah and Hamas, the two main parties there. We've been living with security difficulties for almost 2 years now, to the extent that most of our staff is, from headquarters at least, the headquarters in Gaza, have been relocated to Jerusalem and Amman to function from there. Our field office is fully staffed internationally, and we've been very reliant on our 9,000 local staff in Gaza, the teachers and doctors and social workers and so on. But the violence up until now, these past 2 years, has been from smaller groups, minority groups, groups that aren't quite identified by anyone. It's hard to know who they are or how many they represent. And we took mitigating measures by moving people out. We take precautions by living there. But we've never had to take such serious measures as we now have had since last week, when, first of all, the violence came to Gaza City around the security forces institutions and their buildings and so on. The interesting thing during that period last week is the rest of the Gaza Strip functioned normally. There were, in fact, demonstrations all around the Gaza Strip against what was happening in Gaza City. And now that that sixth ceasefire, I think, that's taken hold now, we hope will continue to hold, and it certainly will hold as long as the Israelis are attacking Gaza the way they are this past week. So this is something, again, people, again, desperate, have nothing to do, have no jobs, have no work, have no resources, and then they fall into these difficulties. So the original interfactional fighting which was earlier this year, still lingers because there's still revenge being taken by the parties on both sides on what happened to their colleagues or relatives or so on. So it's a sad situation. It's made a lot of people in Gaza newly pessimistic. I think Palestinians often, we say how resilient they are and how they maintain their hope, and they're losing some of that now because of the internal fighting that's going on.
Yes.
What is your take on, my name is Stephen Shore, what is your take on the political aspirations of the Palestinians? Is their main goal the peaceful replacement of the State of Israel by a multi-ethnic state, the constitution of a Palestinian state on the West Bank in Gaza, or the peaceful the integration from the refugee camps into those Arab societies in which the camps are constituted?
We don't speak about this. We don't try to represent the Palestinians on this because, for me, having worked for refugees for 26 years now, the basic principle of refugee work is that the refugee must make the individual choice. It's a voluntary choice. Refugees has been identified as one of the final status issues in the whole peace process between Israel and Palestine, and we do have to leave it to that and to hope that there is a choice given to the refugees. I couldn't say, and I think it's difficult for anyone to say, especially from an outsider, what the refugees would say. If you ask any refugee, I think the first thing they'll say is that they expect to have the right of return. If you probe further and ask them about a variety of choices, as you have just mentioned, certainly people will talk about there has to be a Palestinian state at the end of this peace process, and then people will have a genuine choice to make. Do you want to go home to your original home? Do you want to go to the Palestinian state? Do you want to stay where you are? Because some of you are fairly well integrated in where you've taken refuge. So those, I hope that all those choices are put forward for the refugees to decide. And UNRWA's role in all of this will be to implement whatever choices are made by the refugees.
The gentleman in blue and then down here.
Yes, I'm Millage Walker from American University. I was reading in a recent issue of the Christian Science Monitor about the contrast between Muslim extremism in Gaza and a more secular attitude, particularly focused in Hebron. And also, of course, that Gaza is the locus of Hamas, and Hebron is the locus of Fatah. What I'm asking is it possible to reduce the level of isolation on the West Bank without necessarily reducing that on Gaza? Certainly the West Bank population seems to be much more interested in peace negotiations than, say, is the leadership in Hamas.
I'm sorry, I didn't see that article myself. I saw something about it. First of all, there are just two very different situations in Gaza and West Bank. If you looked at the election results, it's hard to say where the focus of which was. It's still pretty much 30% Fatah, 30% Hamas, and 40% who make up the rest. And that's on both Gaza and West Bank side, to our surprise, even in Jerusalem and even in Ramallah, for example. So it's not easy to say. Certainly there are differences, and I think, and I said this myself, having lived in Gaza since just before the Intifada started, I've seen an increasing, I would say, conservatism and many more women with headscarves and so on in Gaza than were present when I first arrived there. Gaza is so completely closed off, even after disengagement. And what where we would all like to start at least is some kind of follow up on the access and movement agreement that was put forward in November of 2005, where there's some link between West Bank and Gaza. That will help. That will help ideas flow. The same thing of opening up Rafah, which was done briefly, letting people out and getting new ideas. But if you close the people in and they have no connection with the outside, the internet isn't good enough for this, then they will have increasingly introverted ideas and so on, and that's what we see happening, I think, in Gaza. I don't, we do, certainly different things could be done because different things are necessary. If we're talking about all of these obstacles on West Bank side, opening up much better, opening up these checkpoints and so on, getting rid of them, would certainly help people, again, to move around, and would help the economy, which is the most devastating thing that's happening, is it's just gone in both places, especially in Gaza, but also in West Bank. How, if you're cut up into 10 cantons and you can't move through these 500 roadblocks and things, how do you move your goods around? How do you move your people around? Even we can't move our staff from the West Bank into Jerusalem, and we have a few hundred who should come in every day. You simply can't function. So it's slowly being destroyed, the land being gobbled up, and the economy being almost non-existent now.
In the second row.
Dan Lieberman, you mentioned two aspects of the situation which seem to be different. The first is that we approach the Palestinians in a unique manner. And I believe the relief agencies of the UN are separate for the Palestinians and for the rest of the world. Why is that? And the second thing is you mentioned that you cannot reconcile the international community's efforts with human rights violations. And why is that? Is that political expediency, thought control, ignorance? How does that come about?
If you're talking, I assume in your first part of your question, the uniqueness of the UN treatment of the Palestinian refugees, that's the UNRWA, the presence of UNRWA. I have a nice book that I'll give you after the lecture that shows the difference between UNRWA and UNHCR and who does what for Palestinians. UNRWA was created before UNHCR to deal with the situation from 1948. And so when UNHCR was created some months later, its mandate was to take care of those refugees who were not already looked after by another UN agency. So that's how that happened and how it's been continued till now. The situation, of course, has gone on for longer than almost any other refugee situation. So there are the difficulties that are associated with a long-standing refugee situation like this. And that it's just to change mandates within the UN and so on it makes more problems probably than trying to struggle with the one that you have. And so that is part of the reason that it continues, and the political reasons too. There are quite different refugee situations by now. As you know, most of the refugees of UNRWA are not in camps. Most of them are self-sufficient, at least they were before the Intifada started. So it's a different kind of, it's a genuinely political refugee situation that we have there. I wasn't quite sure what you were asking on the second question about human rights violations. And
well, how has that come about? It's kind of obvious. What has brought that about? Is it just political expediency?
The violations of the human rights of the Palestinians?
Well,
You mean, yeah. No. Yeah. Well, yes. I think there are lots of influences that don't allow people to assist the Palestinians in ways that maybe other refugees are assisted. That people, I suppose, after many years also get tired of situations and don't respond to them in the same way. The human rights of the Palestinians, the violations against the human rights are very much often related also to the security situation in Israel. So that what happens against the Palestinians is because of the security fears that the Israelis have and the things that the Palestinians have do on their side. For example, the rockets that are sent out from Gaza into Israel, these sorts of things. So, as I say, these are situations that we appreciate, that they do have to be acknowledged, and that there will be reactions to them. And I think that there are Palestinians who understand that very well.
Yes.
Hi, thank you. My name is Dina Dejani with the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. We're in the unfortunate situation right now where we're looking at a new group of Palestinian refugees, this time from Iraq. And my question is, what is UNRWA's purview with these new group of refugees? Do they fall under UNRWA or UNHCR? This is a good question considering what we were just talking about. And what are their options for resettlement? How do they differ from the Palestinian refugees who are currently in the existing camps?
Yes, they're not part of our purview. They are under the mandate of UNHCR. UNHCR is trying to do something about those who are left behind in Iraq, and also those that are on the border of Jordan, and even more the ones that are on the border of Syria, and those that have even come inside. As far as UNRWA's responsibility is concerned, there isn't a direct responsibility, but that we are helping, like all other UN agencies, UNICEF, World Food Program, and others, helping UNHCR deal with those who are on the borders and have come in. Those who've gotten into Syria and Jordan are able to come and come to our schools, use our health facilities if they wish. Some of them can also prove that they meet the definition of a Palestinian refugee. They then can be registered with us even. We've set up a tented school on the camp on the border in the no man's land between Syria and Iraq for the children there. We don't have access, as don't others, to the camp that's right inside the border on the Iraq side, and the 15,000 who are left behind in Iraq, in Baghdad, are of serious concern. The ones on the border are in more miserable conditions, but the ones in Baghdad are in more threatened conditions, I think, for their lives and so on. There's a lot of activity going on. As you know, a big conference was held in Geneva a few weeks ago to try to deal with all the Iraqi refugees as a whole. So there were the 4 billion refugees, perhaps, that are out or displaced Iraqis. And then there are the 15,000 Palestinians. UNHCR asked me to come and speak at the conference, even though it's their issue to back them up on this. And my points were that the Palestinian refugees are the only ones who are really being stopped at the borders, are not allowed to move. So in a way, although there's a very small group, they are being much worse treated than anybody else. Others are allowed to move around. So, so far, not too much success with even getting them into Gaza and West Bank, which we've offered, and which the Palestinian Authority has offered, you know, but we have to get permission from Israel to get them in there. So there are very small offers from places like Chile and Brazil, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but at least it's somebody ready to take these people, because nobody else has in the region or anywhere else.
Yeah, the gentleman in the back.
It is Vladimir Pismena, Ligatex. My question is a little bit historical. Why do you think you have unique agency, uniquely devoted to Palestinians? Since Palestinian question arose 50 years ago, we have probably hundreds of millions of people, refugee, moving back and forth all over the world, and only looks like that Palestinian problems perpetuate itself generation after generation. Why do you think it is happening? And unlike, for example, we don't have agency to help Silesian Germans or I don't know, Turks that were expelled from maybe Bulgaria. We can count it endlessly. People who were moved, who was expelled, but only one people, Palestinian, perpetuate in their refugee camps.
Well, let me try to correct a couple of what are very common misunderstandings. One that as I've already said, UNRWA was created before UNHCR, to take care of the Palestinian refugees, and so it's remained taking care of Palestinian refugees. And when UNHCR was created, it takes care of all other refugees. So if any of those people were defined as refugees, that the groups that you mentioned, UNHCR would be the one to look after them. The other question, though, is about the perpetuation and the descendants. All refugees' descendants remain refugees until the problem is solved, until the root cause is solved, until one of the choices is taken up by the refugees, either resettlement, integration where they are, or repatriation, which is, in UNHCR terms, the preferred solution, that refugees go home. So this is what has not happened for the Palestinians. They haven't yet been given that choice. It's often been, it's a final status issue at the end of the peace process. So until the Palestinians have to solve the political problem and there is a choice given to the refugees, they will remain and their descendants will remain. And that's why we have 4.3 million now from the 800,000 who originally fled from Palestine. Also, just to say a little something about the camps and to emphasize, I think I said it already, but only a third of the refugees live in camps. If they can get out of camps, they get out of camps, and they're mostly self-sufficient, and except when there's an emergency like there has been in the occupied territory for the last 7 years.
We have 3 or 4 more people who would like to ask questions. Yes, and then you're next.
My name is Almut Wieland-Karimi. I work with the German Friedrich Ebert Foundation. And my question to you is, one of the recommendations of the Baker-Hamilton report was to revive the Middle East peace process. So there has been Secretary Rice and our Foreign Minister Steinmeier visiting the region quite frequently, and they want to revive the Middle East Quartet and their initiatives. Does it steer any hope among the Palestinians, or what is their assessment to this new initiative?
Yeah, well, as I said, the Palestinians are beginning to lose hope. They've, I think, seen too much of this before, is what they say now. You know, another revival, another process, and so on. And what is the most discouraging part, the most reason for discouragement, is that the two sides are not acknowledging each other as partners in the peace process. And this has been, you know, something that's been said over and over in the last years about the Palestinians, I think. And that's part of what I was trying to say in my address, too, is that we need to acknowledge that that there are partners on both sides. There are people serious. In fact, the majority of people are serious on both sides about wanting peace, about wanting a two-state solution, about wanting a Palestinian state on one side living in peace with its neighbor Israel. That's what you will find if you take a survey, and that's what you will hear if you talk to the leaders too. So it's that business of getting to the table, and this has been one of the points we've been making in a number of things we've been saying over the past months, is if let's have this acknowledgement, let's get people to the peace table. And that's why it's interesting. I said that the peace process, I more or less said it's fairly dormant right now, but at the same time there is lots of agitation about it now, and there are lots of proposals being put forward. There's the Arab Peace Initiative too that's been looked at kindly by both sides. So if these things can be moved ahead, then perhaps there is some hope, and we would like to encourage all of those.
Yes, that gentleman.
Hi, my name is Afif Curry. I'm for the American Task Force on Palestine. And I was wondering, in your opinion and expertise, do you believe there is a political solution that would resolve the Palestinian refugee problem?
Well, yeah, as I say, if the choice is given to the refugees, then I think there's a possibility. You hear often that everybody knows what the solution is. It's just a matter of getting there. I'm not sure that there is agreement on the solution. These final status issues, which include refugees and Jerusalem and the borders and water, are all very difficult, and people on both sides have different ideas about how they should be solved. So it will take some time. We do know what those issues are, and refugees is one of them. And one thing that is I find us slightly more hopeful over the past year is that there is acknowledgement that refugees is one of the issues that needs to stay on the table, because I think in some of the previous peace processes, the refugees were really left aside, or really put as the final status, or marginalized, or that will come later and we'll solve that later. I don't think that will come later. I think it is one of the basic issues, of course. I have a bias in that, but that is something that I'm glad that people do acknowledge now, that will have to be one of the ones that's addressed immediately with these others.
There are 2 last questions here, if we can go quickly. Yes, you go ahead.
I'm Leah Odenek from APAC. Sorry to belabor this point, but I want to make sure I have it clear. on the issue of UNRWA perpetuating the refugee problem. If a Palestinian moved to the United States, gained citizenship in the United States, have children born in the United States as Americans, are those children who have statehood, are still considered refugees? Aren't refugees stateless people? I just want to make sure that I'm not confused here.
Yeah. No, I think what's confusing is it is somewhat different from other refugees. This is the one major difference. Yes, if they choose to continue their registration and to take advantage of their registration, their children are also, the descendants of those people are still refugees.
And on the political question of the Palestinians having a choice, is it your position that they should have a choice on the right of return to what is Tel Aviv, Haifa, that should be their choice?
They should be given that choice. I mean, this will all be part of the peace process, and one knows that at the end of the peace process that probably will not be a choice given to them. I mean, there are at least two major parties in the peace process, and we know certainly even more clearly recently from the foreign minister of Israel that would be a choice that would not be offered if she's a negotiator. And even in the past, the choice that was given, say at Taba, where perhaps we got the furthest along and in getting toward the final status issues, was there were only some thousands who would be offered some chance to go back to Israel. So yes, the choice should be there. And I think another thing that you will hear from Palestinians is that they certainly want the right of return acknowledged. They want that right acknowledged that some tragedy befell them, that there was a problem that was perpetuated against them, and then from there they will make their choice after that.
Next. And that's the last question. Dave.
I'm Dave Ottaway. I'm a fellow here at the center. My question is, 2 or 3 months ago there was an article in the New York Times, I believe, that said that the amount of money actually going to the Palestinian people had actually increased last year over the year before, and that all kinds of ways had been found around the boycott through the UN organizations and other avenues to actually increase the amount of aid going. Is this correct? And has your budget increased, or are international organizations' budgets increasing to help them?
Well, I may have mentioned that our emergency appeal for this year, for example, is higher than it was any time during the Intifada, but we are not getting more money than we got in the past. No, our budget has not changed because of the situation. Our funds coming to us have not been increased in any significant way. Where the additional money mainly came from was the European Temporary International Mechanism set up by the Europeans to bypass the Palestinian Authority and yet to provide aid. And they did give more aid last year than in the past as the situation became increasingly bad and poor for the Palestinians because of the general boycott. So what we have seen, though, and what you'll see from recent World Bank reports and others, is that what it was is it's just making Palestinians aid dependent instead of really contributing to building the structures and keeping the economy going or restarting the economy, because there's no problem with Palestinians running their own government and their own economy. They can do that very well, and there are all sorts of businesses and other industries, and even in the small little Gaza Strip that could support the people. But you can't have that if you're completely sealed off and you can't move your people and your goods. We have a nice statistic we give about in the December of 2005. There were 900 small sewing factories in Gaza, employing around 25,000 people, a few sewing machines here and there. And it was mostly producing clothes that went to Israel. And today there are none. So all of those people are out of work. There is no sewing factory because the materials can't come in, and then the finished product couldn't go out. So this is the kind of thing that's happening throughout with all of the economy that was there.
I want to thank all of you for coming. I want to thank Karen Koning, AbuZayd, for being with us. And congratulations again on your honor at DePaul College. We stand adjourned. I hope you come back to the Wilson Center again, but thank you all for coming.
Great to see you. Good to see you again.